The morning of August 16th, 1941, brought Flight Sergeant Bert Moss before Wing Commander Victor Beamish at RAF Biggin Hill under circumstances that could end with a firing squad. The charge was sabotage. The evidence seemed damning. Moss had systematically contaminated the cooling systems of every Spitfire in 74 Squadron, deliberately introducing air into sealed glycol circuits that every technical manual, every training course, and every engineer at Rolls-Royce insisted must remain absolutely free of contamination. Air pockets caused hotspots. Air pockets restricted circulation. Air pockets led to catastrophic engine failure and dead pilots. Moss had created air pockets in 18 operational fighters. The technical officer from the Air Ministry, a pre-war Rolls-Royce engineer named Patterson, stood beside Beamish's desk with the rigid certainty of a man whose entire professional existence rested on the inviolability of engineering doctrine. He had documented everything: the coolant levels in 3 Spitfires that didn't match service logs, the systematic underfilling across the squadron's entire flight line, the half-pint discrepancies that revealed deliberate, methodical violation of procedures designed to keep pilots alive. Patterson's recommendation was unambiguous: immediate arrest, court-martial. In the paranoid atmosphere of wartime Britain, deliberately sabotaging engine cooling systems looked less like mechanical incompetence and more like enemy action. But Beamish, a decorated fighter pilot with 200 combat sorties behind him, asked an awkward question that would unravel Patterson's certainty and eventually transform Rolls-Royce's understanding of what their own engines could tolerate. If Moss was sabotaging aircraft, why had 74 Squadron's engine failure rate dropped to nearly 0 over the past fortnight? Why were pilots reporting better high-altitude performance than they'd experienced in months? Why had Beamish himself held emergency boost for 12 consecutive minutes during an engagement over Boulogne 3 days earlier, something that should have cooked his Merlin, yet returned to Biggin Hill without incident? The contradiction demanded explanation. Either Moss had discovered something that contradicted fundamental cooling system theory, or 18 Spitfires were about to fail catastrophically and kill their pilots. There was no middle ground. Understanding how a 42-year-old flight sergeant with grease under his fingernails came to challenge the collective wisdom of Rolls-Royce's engineering department requires going back to the summer of 1941, when Fighter Command's tactical situation had shifted in ways the Merlin's designers hadn't anticipated. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Battle of Britain had ended in October 1940. Fighter Command had won, but victory brought new demands that transformed the nature of air combat over Western Europe. The desperate defensive scrambles of 1940, brief furious engagements over Kent and Sussex, gave way to offensive operations that pushed deep into occupied France. Circus missions, rhubarbs, bomber escorts to targets in the Ruhr Valley, fighter sweeps designed to draw the Luftwaffe into battle on British terms. These missions required something the Merlin hadn't been designed to deliver: sustained maximum performance at altitude for 30, sometimes 40 minutes at a stretch. The engine that had won the Battle of Britain through short bursts of combat power now struggled with operational tempos that its cooling system couldn't quite handle. Squadron leader Douglas Bader's logbook from July 1941 contained an entry that became disturbingly common across Fighter Command: engine temperature critical at Angels 20. Broke off. Engagement. The Merlin 45, powering the Spitfire Mark V, could produce over 1,400 horsepower, but that power generated heat faster than the ethylene glycol coolant could carry it away, faster than the radiator could dissipate it into the slipstream at 20,000 feet. Pilots learned to dread the moment when tactical necessity demanded emergency boost. That lever on the throttle quadrant could push manifold pressure beyond 12 pounds per square inch, delivering the power needed to catch a Messerschmitt or escape an ambush. But pulling it also meant gambling with temperatures. The additional power generated heat that approached the margins of what the cooling system could handle. Temperature gauges climbed past 100 degrees Celsius, then 110, then into ranges where cylinder heads could crack and pistons could seize. Some pilots reported hearing a distinctive knock through the airframe, the sound of pre-detonation, of fuel igniting too early, of an engine eating itself from the inside. The statistics told a grim story that Fighter Command Headquarters tried to keep quiet. Between June and September 1941, several squadrons lost more Spitfires and Hurricanes to engine failures than to enemy action during certain operational periods. Squadron maintenance logs filled with euphemistic entries: coolant loss, cause unknown, abnormal temperature rise under boost, cylinder head failure following extended combat power. At RAF Hornchurch, 11 Spitfires were grounded in a single week awaiting engine changes. At Biggin Hill, the engineering officer reported that his squadrons were effectively flying with 70% availability because the remaining 30% sat with seized or damaged Merlins, waiting for replacement engines that took weeks to arrive from maintenance units. What made this crisis particularly bitter was the knowledge that German pilots weren't facing the same limitations. The Daimler-Benz 601, powering the Messerschmitt Bf 109, used a different cooling architecture, one that handled sustained high-power operation more gracefully. Intelligence reports suggested the Luftwaffe could maintain combat boost for significantly longer periods without the catastrophic failures plaguing the Merlin. British pilots weren't just fighting skilled opponents. They were fighting with one hand tied behind their backs, forced to manage their engines as carefully as their ammunition and fuel. A pilot who pushed too hard risked returning to base trailing glycol vapor, or worse, not returning at all because his engine had seized over the channel. Flight Sergeant Bert Moss spent his days elbow-deep in Merlin engines at RAF Biggin Hill, and he had developed opinions that made engineering officers uncomfortable. At 42, he was older than most ground crew, a veteran who'd maintained Sopwith Camels during the previous war before spending 20 years at a Coventry motorworks. When the RAF recalled him in 1939, they'd assigned him to 74 Squadron, where his pre-war experience with liquid-cooled engines made him invaluable. By summer 1941, Moss had logged more hours maintaining Spitfire Merlins than perhaps any other NCO in fighter command. He'd also developed a reputation for ignoring procedures when they contradicted his instincts. Squadron engineering officers tolerated this because Moss's engines ran reliably. His turnaround times were exceptional, and pilots trusted aircraft he'd personally inspected. But his habit of muttering about bloody engineers who'd never heard a sick engine didn't endear him to visiting technical officers from Rolls-Royce or the Air Ministry. The observation that would change everything began with a routine inconsistency that Moss noticed in early July. Spitfires returning from dawn patrols, the first flights after engines had sat cold overnight, consistently ran cooler during subsequent high-power ground tests than aircraft that had flown later in the day. Initially, he assumed this reflected ambient temperature differences. Morning air was cooler. Radiators worked more efficiently, perfectly logical. But the pattern persisted even when he conducted ground runs at identical times, controlling for air temperature. More puzzling still, the effect wasn't consistent across all aircraft. Some Spitfires showed dramatic differences in cooling behavior between morning and afternoon operations, while others showed almost none. Moss began tracking which aircraft exhibited this characteristic, noting tail numbers in a battered notebook he carried in his coverall pocket. Over 3 weeks, a pattern emerged that made no engineering sense whatsoever. The aircraft that cooled best had all been serviced by the same small group of ground crew who shared a particular habit that Moss had been trying to break them of for months. These young mechanics had developed a shortcut during coolant top-ups. Official procedure required bleeding the system completely to remove all air before sealing it, a 15-minute process involving meticulous attention to bleed valves, positioned at high points throughout the cooling passages. But several young airmen had discovered they could save time by filling the system quickly and letting any trapped air work its way out during engine operation. The engines would burp and gurgle for the first few minutes of running. Coolant level would drop slightly, and they'd top it off. Technically improper, but it got aircraft serviceable faster when squadrons were scrambling to meet availability targets. Moss had corrected this sloppy practice countless times. Air in cooling systems was absolutely forbidden by every manual, every technical order, every training course. Air pockets caused hot spots, restricted circulation, and led to catastrophic failures. Every mechanic learned this on day one. Except Moss's notebook suggested that aircraft with these supposedly dangerous air pockets were somehow running cooler under high boost conditions than perfectly bled systems. He tested this observation with deliberate rigor that would have impressed any research engineer. He selected two identical Spitfire Mark Vs, both with fresh Merlin 45 engines, both with identical flying hours since major service. He bled one system absolutely perfectly, spending 20 minutes ensuring not a single air bubble remained. The other he filled, using the airman's shortcut method, leaving the system with obvious air content visible through the header tank. Then he ran both engines through identical power profiles on the test stand, monitoring coolant temperatures with calibrated gauges he'd borrowed from the instrument shop without asking permission. The results contradicted everything he'd been taught. The properly bled engine ran 5 degrees hotter at maximum boost. The engine with air in its cooling system stayed cooler, more stable, and showed less tendency towards sudden temperature spikes when he cycled the power rapidly between cruise and combat settings. Moss ran the test again. Then, a third time. Then a fourth, methodically documenting results that should have been impossible. The engine with air pockets consistently outperformed the perfectly bled system when operating at maximum boost. But understanding why required Moss to think beyond his mechanics training and consider what was actually happening inside those coolant passages when an engine ran at extreme power levels that designers had never intended for. Sustained operation. The official reasoning behind air-free systems made perfect sense for normal operation. Liquid coolant in direct contact with hot metal absorbed heat far more efficiently than air ever could. Water's specific heat capacity, the amount of thermal energy required to raise its temperature, was roughly 4 times higher than air's. Ethylene glycol mixtures weren't quite as efficient as pure water, but still vastly superior to air for heat transfer. Therefore, any air pocket represented a cooling failure, a dead zone where heat couldn't transfer properly. Every engineering manual stated this as fundamental truth, as immutable as gravity or thermodynamics. But Moss began to suspect that maximum boost operation wasn't normal operation. The heat generated during sustained high power created conditions the designers hadn't fully considered, conditions that occurred at the ragged edge of what the cooling system could handle. He'd noticed something during his ground runs that the temperature data didn't quite capture. The perfectly bled engines showed smooth, steadily climbing temperatures under boost, exactly what theory predicted. But the engines with air pockets showed initial temperature spikes followed by stabilization at lower levels. That stabilization pattern suggested something was happening that improved heat transfer after the initial transient, something that the perfectly sealed systems couldn't achieve. The answer came to him while watching a kettle boil in the sergeant's mess one evening. Water boiling violently, steam rising, far more vigorous heat transfer than simple convection in a closed pot. Boiling represented a phase change, liquid becoming vapor, and phase changes absorbed enormous amounts of energy through latent heat of vaporization. What if the small air pockets he'd introduced weren't simply dead zones, but nucleation sites? Places where superheated coolant could begin forming vapor bubbles that would absorb heat through phase change. In a perfectly sealed, air-free system operating under pressure, the coolant remained liquid even when it absorbed dangerous amounts of heat. It became superheated, liquid existing above its normal boiling point, held in that state by system pressure and the absence of nucleation sites where bubbles could form. This superheated coolant could create hot spots in cylinder heads, regions where metal temperatures soared because the liquid couldn't efficiently carry heat away. The coolant was too hot, paradoxically, to cool properly. But introduce controlled air pockets, and something remarkable happened. These tiny volumes of compressible gas allowed localized pressure variations. Where coolant temperature peaked, precisely where cooling was most desperately needed, microscopic vapor bubbles could form, absorb tremendous thermal energy through the phase change from liquid to gas. then collapse back to liquid as they circulated toward cooler regions in the radiator. The process repeated thousands of times per second, creating a two-phase flow that transferred heat far more aggressively than single-phase liquid circulation alone. Modern engineers would recognize this as nucleate boiling, a heat transfer regime that wouldn't be fully understood and exploited in engine cooling until decades later. Moss had stumbled onto it through observation and mechanical intuition, without the theoretical framework to explain why it worked. He simply knew that his contaminated systems ran cooler when it mattered most. The trick lay in controlling the air content precisely. Too little and the effect didn't manifest. Too much, and you created genuine vapor lock, large air pockets that blocked circulation entirely and caused catastrophic overheating that could destroy an engine in minutes. Moss developed a feel for the correct amount through trial and error conducted in the quiet hours after the last patrol had landed. He'd fill the system to about 95% capacity rather than the specified 100%, then run the engine briefly and observe how the coolant level settled. When it dropped by roughly half a pint and stabilized, he judged it right. He began applying this technique to 74 Squadron's entire flight line, working quietly at night to avoid questions from officers who'd demand explanations he couldn't properly articulate. Within a week, the squadron's engine temperature complaints dropped noticeably. Within 2 weeks, pilots were commenting on improved boost endurance during debriefings. Some mentioned being able to hold combat power longer without watching their temperature gauges climb into the red. Squadron leader Alan Deere, commanding 74 Squadron's B flight, recorded something particularly telling in his logbook on August 11th. During an engagement with Messerschmitt 109s over Boulogne, he'd maintained emergency boost for 12 consecutive minutes while climbing through 22,000 feet, something that should have cooked his engine. Instead, temperatures remained manageable, and he'd returned to Biggin Hill without incident. Deere wanted to know what had changed. His engine had always been temperamental at high boost, requiring careful power management to avoid overheating. Now it ran like it had found an extra margin he hadn't known existed. Moss's quiet experiment ended abruptly on the 16th of August, 1941, when Patterson, the visiting technical officer from the Air Ministry, noticed coolant levels in 3 Spitfires that didn't match the service logs. The discrepancy was minor, roughly half a pint low in each aircraft, but it triggered a detailed inspection that revealed Moss's systematic underfilling across the entire squadron. By noon, he was standing before Wing Commander Beamish, explaining why he deliberately violated technical orders on operational aircraft. The initial accusation was sabotage, and Patterson's logic seemed airtight. Air in cooling systems caused engine failures. Moss knew this. Every mechanic knew this. Therefore, Moss had knowingly created conditions likely to destroy engines and kill pilots. The evidence was documented. The violation was systematic. The intent appeared malicious. Patterson recommended immediate arrest pending court-martial. But Beamish pressed harder with his awkward questions. If Moss was sabotaging aircraft, why had 74 Squadron's engine failure rate dropped to nearly zero? Why were pilots reporting better performance? Why had Beamish himself experienced improved engine behavior? Patterson dismissed this as coincidence or misinterpretation. Pilots weren't engineers. They couldn't accurately judge cooling performance. Their observations meant nothing against established theory. But Beamish had flown enough combat to recognize when his engine was struggling. Every pilot at Biggin Hill had learned to nurse their Merlin through long patrols, to manage temperature by easing off boost at critical moments, to accept that emergency power meant gambling with engine survival. Yet recently, several pilots had reported being able to hold maximum boost longer without the temperature gauge climbing into danger zones. Moss produced his notebook. 3 weeks of temperature readings and observations that Patterson immediately derided as methodologically worthless. The measurements weren't calibrated to laboratory standards. The conditions weren't controlled. The entire exercise reflected a mechanic's amateur theorizing rather than proper engineering science. But the data showed a consistent pattern across multiple aircraft. And Beamish, desperate for anything that might improve his squadron's operational effectiveness, proposed a compromise that would either vindicate Moss or prove Patterson's accusations correct. Biggin Hill had a war-weary Spitfire Mark V, tail number W3647, that had been written off following a wheels-up landing the previous week. The airframe was bent, the undercarriage damaged beyond economical repair, but the engine remained serviceable. The aircraft was scheduled for scrapping, its Merlin to be returned to maintenance units for rebuild. Before that happened, Beamish suggested, why not let Moss demonstrate his technique under controlled conditions that would satisfy even Patterson's demands? For rigor? Patterson objected strenuously. Using a condemned aircraft for unauthorized experiments violated numerous regulations, but Beamish outranked him on station, and the Wing Commander's patience with Air Ministry technical officers had worn thin after months of watching his pilots struggle with overheating engines while engineers promised improvements that never materialized. The test would occur in 2 days. They'd mount the aircraft on ground test equipment, install calibrated temperature sensors at multiple points in the cooling system, and establish a precise power profile that simulated sustained combat conditions. They'd run the engine twice, once with Moss's air pocket technique, once with a perfectly bled system according to official procedures. The data would settle the question. The test occurred 2 days later, on the 18th of August, under conditions that satisfied even Patterson's demands for scientific rigor. They'd installed calibrated thermocouples at 6 points throughout the cooling system, cylinder head outlets, radiator inlet and outlet, header tank, and 2 positions in the main coolant galleries. A chart recorder borrowed from the engine test facility at RAF Henlow documented temperatures continuously throughout each run. The power profile simulated what pilots actually experienced during extended combat operations over France. Warm-up at idle, climb to simulated altitude equivalent using throttle settings that matched 20,000 feet density, then maximum continuous boost at +9 pounds per square inch for 15 minutes. If the engine could handle that without exceeding temperature limits, it was performing better than most Spitfires currently in squadron service. They ran the first test with a perfectly bled cooling system, exactly as Rolls-Royce technical orders specified. Patterson personally supervised the bleeding process, ensuring not a single air bubble remained in the system. He checked each bleed valve twice, watching coolant flow until it emerged clear and bubble-free. The header tank showed pure liquid glycol right to the fill line. When Moss signaled ready, the ground crew fired the engine. It caught on the second blade, settling into the familiar rumble of 12 cylinders firing in perfect sequence. Moss ran through the warm-up procedure by the book, bringing oil and coolant temperatures into normal ranges before advancing the throttle. At simulated combat power, the engine performed exactly as Patterson expected. Temperature climbed steadily, predictably. At 5 minutes, coolant temperature reached 105 degrees Celsius. At 8 minutes, 112 degrees. At 10 minutes, 118 degrees, approaching the 120-degree limit that marked the boundary between acceptable operation and potential damage. Patterson ordered the throttle closed before they risked the engine. Standard Merlin behavior under sustained maximum power. Exactly what pilots experienced in combat. Exactly what forced them to ease off boost during long engagements to let temperatures recover. The chart recorder's trace showed a smooth, monotonic temperature rise that matched theoretical predictions perfectly. Patterson made notes in his report book with the satisfaction of a man whose understanding of thermodynamics had been confirmed by experimental data. Moss spent 40 minutes draining the system, then refilling it using his carefully developed technique. He filled to approximately 95% capacity, ran the engine briefly to let air distribute through the system, watched the coolant level drop by half a pint as air pockets formed in high points throughout the cooling passages, then topped it off to his preferred level. Patterson watched with unconcealed skepticism, timing the procedure and noting every deviation from approved methods in his report. When Moss signaled ready for the second test, Patterson's expression suggested he expected catastrophic failure within minutes. They ran an identical power profile, warm-up, climb simulation, then maximum continuous boost at +9 pounds per square inch, The difference appeared within 3 minutes. Where the properly bled system had shown smooth temperature rise, Moss's version exhibited an initial spike to 107 degrees. Then, something remarkable happened. Instead of continuing to climb steadily, temperature stabilized. At 5 minutes, the gauge read 108 degrees. At 8 minutes, where the first test had reached concerning temperatures, it read 110 degrees. At 10 minutes, 112 degrees. At 12 minutes, 113 degrees. They continued for 15 minutes, the full duration they'd planned. Temperature never exceeded 115 degrees, well within safe operating limits. When Moss finally closed the throttle, Patterson stood staring at the chart recorder trace with an expression that suggested his fundamental understanding of reality had been challenged. The sensor data told an even more revealing story. The perfectly bled system showed uniform temperature rise across all measurement points, exactly what theory predicted for single-phase liquid cooling. Moss's system showed localized temperature variations, micro-fluctuations that suggested turbulent two-phase flow in regions of highest heat concentration. The cooling wasn't more efficient everywhere. It was dramatically more efficient precisely where efficiency mattered most, in the cylinder heads where combustion heat concentrated and where overheating began. Patterson departed Biggin Hill that afternoon without recommending court-martial, though his report to the Air Ministry described Moss's technique as unauthorized field modification, requiring comprehensive engineering evaluation before any consideration of formal adoption. In bureaucratic language, this meant the official channels would study the problem for months while producing no immediate solution. Beamish interpreted Patterson's careful language differently. The Air Ministry wouldn't actively oppose the technique, but wouldn't endorse it either, which meant squadron commanders could make their own decisions based on operational necessity rather than waiting for official approval that might never come. By early September, Moss found himself explaining his procedure to ground crew from 3 other squadrons at Biggin Hill. He demonstrated the filling technique, emphasized the critical importance of precise air content, and taught the visual checks that confirmed correct system behavior. The coolant level had to drop by approximately half a pint during initial running. No more, no less. Too little meant insufficient nucleation sites. Too much meant dangerous vapor lock. These mechanics returned to their own squadrons and quietly implemented the modification. Within a fortnight, Biggin Hill's engine temperature complaints dropped by 2/3. Pilots stopped aborting sorties due to overheating. Squadron availability improved as fewer aircraft sat grounded awaiting engine replacements. The technique spread through the unofficial network that connected RAF ground crew across fighter command. Mechanics talked during station football matches, in sergeants' messes, at maintenance training courses. A flight sergeant from Biggin Hill would mention improved cooling performance to a counterpart from RAF Kenley, who'd ask questions, take notes, and try it himself. By October, squadrons at Hornchurch, Northolt, and Tangmere were using variations of Moss's air pocket method without official authorization or formal documentation. Engineering officers faced an impossible choice. They could enforce regulations and watch their pilots struggle with overheating engines, or they could quietly tolerate an unauthorized modification that demonstrably worked. Most chose their pilots over their paperwork. Operational results spoke louder than engineering theory. Autumn 1941 saw Fighter Command mount increasingly aggressive sweeps over occupied France. Circus operations pairing bomber formations with massive fighter escorts, designed to draw the Luftwaffe into combat. These missions demanded everything the Merlin could give. Pilots needed sustained high boost to maintain formation at altitude, to climb rapidly when bounced by German fighters, to chase down Messerschmitts over hostile territory. Engine reliability directly determined mission effectiveness. A pilot who had to abort due to engine problems not only failed his mission, but left his formation one fighter short, potentially exposing his squadron mates to greater danger. Squadron records from this period show striking patterns. Units using Moss's technique reported 20 to 30% fewer aborted sorties due to engine problems. Pilots logged longer periods at combat power without temperature excursions. Most tellingly, the rate of catastrophic engine failures, pistons seizing, cylinder heads cracking, dropped noticeably in squadrons where ground crew had adopted the air pocket modification. The true test of Moss's technique came not over the familiar fields of Kent, but in the desperate skies above Malta. By January 1942, the island fortress had endured 18 months of siege, supplied only by convoy and defended by a handful of Hurricane and Spitfire squadrons facing overwhelming Axis air superiority. Every aircraft mattered, every sortie counted. Engine reliability meant the difference between maintaining air defence and surrendering the island to starvation and bombardment. Malta's squadrons faced unique cooling challenges that made Moss's discovery particularly valuable. The Mediterranean heat, often exceeding 35 degrees Celsius, reduced radiator efficiency before aircraft even left the ground. Pilots needed to scramble rapidly to altitude, intercept Italian and German bomber formations, then maintain combat power during extended engagements, all while operating from primitive facilities with limited spare parts and overworked ground crew. Flight Sergeant James McLeod arrived at RAF Lucca in February 1942, transferred from Biggin Hill specifically because of his experience with Moss's cooling modification. He brought documentation, copies of Moss's notebook, temperature charts, and detailed procedures refined through 6 months of squadron use. Within 3 weeks, McLeod had trained Lucca's ground crew and implemented the air pocket technique across 249 Squadron Spitfires. The operational impact proved immediate and measurable. Before the modification, 249 Squadron averaged 12 serviceable aircraft daily from an establishment of 18, with engine cooling problems accounting for roughly 40% of unserviceability. By April, average serviceability had climbed to 15 aircraft, with cooling-related, groundings reduced to less than 15%. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. In an environment where 3 additional serviceable fighters could mean the difference between breaking up a bomber formation or watching it devastate the dockyards, this improvement directly affected Malta's survival. The island's defenders were fighting with the thinnest possible margin. Every aircraft that could fly mattered. Every sortie that didn't abort due to mechanical failure helped blunt the Axis assault. Patrol endurance increased noticeably. Previously, pilots had learned to manage engine temperatures by cycling power settings during long defensive patrols, dropping to cruise boost every 10 or 15 minutes to let temperatures recover. This power management worked, but left fighters vulnerable during the throttle-back periods when German fighters might bounce them. With Moss's cooling modification, pilots could maintain higher average power throughout patrols, extending effective combat radius and increasing the probability of successful intercepts before bombers reached their targets. They could chase Italian bombers further out to sea. They could maintain combat speed longer during engagements with Messerschmitts. They could accept combat under conditions that previously would have forced them to decline due to engine temperature concerns. Squadron leader Laddie Lucas, commanding 249 Squadron during Malta's darkest months, wrote in his post-war memoir about the unexpected improvement in operational tempo that spring. His pilots suddenly found they could press attacks more aggressively, pursue damaged bombers further, and sustain high-speed chases without the constant anxiety about temperature gauges climbing into danger zones. Lucas attributed part of Malta's successful defence during March and April 1942 to this improved engine reliability. Though official histories would overlook the connection entirely, the Air Ministry's accounts of Malta's defence focused on pilot courage, radar effectiveness, and the arrival of Spitfire reinforcements. Nowhere did they mention a Biggin Hill flight sergeant's unauthorised cooling modification. The technique's importance became even more apparent during preparations for Operation Jubilee, the Dieppe raid planned for August 1942. This operation would require Fighter Command to mount the largest single-day air effort since the Battle of Britain, with 68 squadrons flying more than 2,900 sorties in direct support of the landing force. Squadron planners calculated that maintaining continuous air cover over the beachhead would push Merlin engines to their absolute limits. Fighters would fly multiple sorties throughout the day, returning to base for rapid refueling and rearming before launching again. Engines would have minimal time to cool between sorties. Operational tempo would be relentless. 11 Group headquarters quietly surveyed squadron engineering officers about cooling system reliability during sustained high-power operations. The responses revealed a stark divide between squadrons using conventional cooling procedures and those that had adopted Moss's modification through the ground crew network. Units using the air pocket technique reported 40% better temperature stability during simulated maximum endurance profiles. Combat power could be maintained longer without approaching critical temperatures. Engine failures during high-tempo operations were significantly reduced. This data influenced the operational plan directly. Squadrons with modified cooling systems received assignments requiring longer over-water patrols and extended combat air patrol stations. The planners trusted these units to handle the most demanding missions because their engines could deliver sustained performance, without the cooling problems that plagued conventionally maintained aircraft. On the 19th of August, as Dieppe burned and Allied troops fought desperately to evacuate, Fighter Command Spitfires and Hurricanes flew patrol after patrol throughout the day. Some aircraft logged 4 separate missions, totaling more than 6 hours of flight time, an unprecedented operational intensity that should have resulted in widespread engine failures. The feared wave of cooling-related breakdowns never materialized. Squadrons maintained sortie rates that shocked even optimistic planners. Post-operation maintenance reports noted remarkably few cooling-related problems considering the operational intensity. Aircraft that in previous campaigns would have been grounded with overheating damage continued flying mission after mission. The Dieppe operation proved costly for Allied ground forces, but Fighter Command's performance demonstrated something important. When properly maintained, using techniques that maximized cooling efficiency, Merlin engines could sustain operational tempos that official specifications suggested were impossible. Rolls-Royce never officially acknowledged Moss's technique. After the war, when engineers compiled comprehensive histories of Merlin development, the air pocket cooling modification appeared nowhere in the documentation. Official technical evolution charts showed improved radiator designs introduced in 1943, revised coolant mixtures, and eventually the 2-stage supercharged variants that rendered the entire cooling crisis obsolete through better thermal management. The contribution of a Biggin Hill flight sergeant remained absent from these carefully curated narratives. This omission reflected engineering culture more than deliberate erasure. Moss had violated fundamental doctrine, achieved results through methods that contradicted established theory, and propagated his technique through informal networks rather than proper channels. From Rolls-Royce's perspective, endorsing such unauthorized field modifications would undermine the entire structure of engineering authority and quality control that made reliable mass production possible. Better to let the modification fade into operational history than to validate mechanics second-guessing formally trained engineers. Better to maintain the fiction that improvements came through proper research and development, rather than admitting that a middle-aged sergeant with intuition and grease under his fingernails had discovered something the Patterson company's best engineers had missed. Yet the physics Moss stumbled upon eventually received full theoretical vindication. By the 1960s, researchers studying advanced cooling systems for jet engines and nuclear reactors had developed comprehensive understanding of two-phase heat transfer. They discovered that controlled nucleate boiling, the formation and collapse of vapor bubbles in liquid coolant, could transfer heat 5 to 10 times more efficiently than single-phase liquid convection. Engineers designed entire cooling systems around this principle, incorporating features that deliberately encouraged bubble formation in high-heat regions. Modern high-performance engines routinely exploit two-phase cooling, using precisely the phenomenon Moss had accidentally triggered in Spitfire Merlins 20 years earlier. Contemporary automotive racing engines, where power density approaches Merlin levels, employ cooling systems that operate in partial boiling regimes. The nucleation sites Moss created with his air pockets have been replaced by sophisticated surface treatments that promote controlled bubble formation. But the underlying physics remains identical. What Moss intuited through observation, 21st-century engineers calculate with computational fluid dynamics and implement with precision manufacturing. The gap between field innovation and academic understanding sometimes spans decades, but eventually theory catches up to practice. The broader lesson extends beyond cooling systems and Merlin engines. Operational necessity drives innovation in directions that pure theory cannot predict. The best engineering solutions sometimes emerge from sergeants with greasy hands rather than graduate engineers with pristine calculations. Problems that seem intractable in the laboratory sometimes yield to practical experimentation by people who live with the consequences of failure. Moss's discovery mattered not because it was theoretically elegant, but because it worked when nothing else did. In summer 1941, Fighter Command needed a solution to cooling problems that threatened operational effectiveness. Official channels offered promises and proposals. Moss offered half a pint of trapped air and empirical evidence that contradicted every manual. He was nearly executed for it. Instead, his technique saved hundreds of pilots who never knew his name. Bert Moss himself returned to civilian life in 1946, taking a position at a Coventry engineering works, where he spent 2 decades maintaining industrial machinery. He never spoke publicly about his wartime cooling innovation, never claimed credit, and died in 1968 without seeing his contribution acknowledged in any official history. Former squadron mates who attended his funeral remembered him as the mechanic who somehow kept their aircraft flying when it mattered most, though few understood the technical details of what he'd actually accomplished. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his wartime service with the RAF, but said nothing about the thousands of combat sorties that succeeded because engines ran cooler than theory said they should. The most significant wartime contributions often vanish into unmarked history because they don't fit comfortable narratives about how innovation is supposed to occur. Official histories prefer stories of brilliant engineers working in proper facilities following approved methods. They're less comfortable with stories of mechanics violating regulations based on intuition, nearly facing firing squads, and being vindicated only when desperation forced testing that contradicted doctrine. Moss's story survives only in squadron records, maintenance logs, and the fading memories of ground crew who learned his technique during the desperate years when Britain needed every aircraft, every engine, and every unauthorized trick that might keep pilots alive for one more sortie. The documentation exists in archives that few researchers examine, scattered across station records from Biggin Hill, Lucca, Hornchurch, and a dozen other bases where mechanics quietly adopted a modification that worked better than official procedures. The principle Moss discovered, that controlled vapor formation could enhance cooling beyond what liquid-only circulation could achieve, eventually became fundamental to high-performance engine design. But that vindication came decades too late for the man who discovered it while trying to keep Spitfires flying through the summer of 1941. Physics doesn't care about credentials or regulations. Thermodynamics doesn't defer to institutional authority. Heat transfer obeys laws that work the same whether discovered by corporate engineers or flight sergeants. Moss found a way to make Merlin engines run cooler under conditions their designers hadn't anticipated, using principles that wouldn't be formally understood for another 20 years. He did it with a half-pint shortfall, careful observation, and the willingness to trust empirical results over theoretical certainty. In doing so, he joined a long tradition of practical mechanics who solve problems that baffle theoretical specialists, not through superior education, but through intimate knowledge of how machines actually behave under conditions that never appear in textbooks. The Spitfires that fought over France in autumn 1941, that defended Malta through spring 1942, that flew 4 sorties on the 19th of August during the Dieppe operation, many of them ran with cooling systems that contained the precise amount of air contamination that every manual insisted would destroy them. They ran cooler, more reliably, and longer than officially maintained aircraft, because their cooling systems exploited physics that wouldn't be formally codified until the jet age. And they did so because a 42-year-old flight sergeant at Biggin Hill had noticed something that didn't make sense, tested it systematically despite lacking formal authorization, and risked his career, possibly his life, to implement a solution that contradicted everything the experts believed. Sometimes the most important innovations emerge not from laboratories but from maintenance pens, not from theory but from careful observation of how machines actually behave when pushed beyond design limits. Sometimes the critical breakthroughs come from people who lack the theoretical framework to explain why something works, but possess the practical wisdom to recognize that it does. Bert Moss never published a paper on nucleate boiling heat transfer. He never received a medal for improving Merlin cooling efficiency. He never appeared in official histories of RAF engineering innovation. But hundreds of pilots returned safely from missions over occupied Europe because their engines ran cooler than Rolls-Royce thought possible, thanks to a modification that nearly got its inventor shot for sabotage. That story, buried in squadron logs and maintenance records, represents something fundamental about how military technology actually advances during wartime. Not always through proper channels and approved procedures, but sometimes through intuition, observation, and the courage to challenge doctrine when survival demands better solutions than theory can provide. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.